Reed, I'm going to hand it off to you to give your first 2 minutes of an introduction, and then we'll jump right into questions. And this is Reed Steberger for District 3.
4.
District. It's been a long night for me, too. District 4.
Hey, everybody. How's it going? Good. Staying warm? Oh, yeah. There's nothing they can do. I want to start first by just acknowledging the land that we're on. So we are on Cayuga land. This is land that historically belonged to the Cayuga Nation and the Haudenosaunee. And I want to just take a moment to reflect on that actively first before we get going. And I also want to acknowledge the Southside Community Center and say thank you to Southside for having us in this space. So much happens out of this center, and the space that they keep here is really critical for our community, whether or not you live in this district or in this neighborhood. So I don't know how many minutes I have left, but I'm going to try to cover a couple of things about myself. I just want to say what I do, a little bit about why I'm running, and then the approach that we're using. So, like I said, my name is Reed Steberger. In my day job, I work as the programs coordinator of the Multicultural Resource Center, and I also work for the Tompkins County Climate Protection Initiative. I've worked with TICP, is a cute name, right? For about 5 years on the steering committee and then as staff, and I've worked at the Multicultural Resource Center for 2 years. At the Multicultural Resource Center, I coordinated the New Jim Crow Community Book Read, focusing on mass incarceration, its impacts locally. We engaged 800 people in reading that book and distributed 2,000 copies of it. I also led the redesign of a program called the Talking Circles on Race and Racism, which is one of our community's flagship programs on having dialogue and discourse about addressing and confronting racism here in our community. And that's done in a caucus for white folks and a caucus for people of color. And I also coordinate a youth racial justice organizing program where I teach young people, help them learn, right, how to organize themselves. And they're pushing to implement a program called participatory budgeting here in the 2nd Ward. So if anyone's interested in that, I'd love to connect you with them. And then for TICP, I work on various climate initiatives, focusing on writing our climate justice column, looking at the intersections of race and environment. I came up to Ithaca in 2009 for my undergraduate in August. And by October, I was working with Dominic Frangillo, who is the youngest council member in the town of Caroline on the Cooperative Extension's Energy Corps program. And what I realized when I was out knocking on doors is that there are people whose homes I had energy audited in 2009 and 10 in my district. And I ran into Tom Shelley, who I think a lot of people here probably know. And he said, I've made so many energy efficiency updates to my house now, and now that I'm in retirement, I'm saving so much money. And it was just kind of this blast from the past that, like, 8 years ago, when I first moved here, I had walked into this house not really knowing what I was doing and installed this blower door, and that helped somebody save money today. So, yeah.
So, tell us, what does being progressive mean to you?
That's a great question. So, who here knows what the word, who here speaks Spanish? Yeah. What does the word podemos mean?
Power or potential, or that we're capable of doing something?
Yeah, we can. It's the name of a Spanish political party. Podemos, we can, right? Podemos is a political party that came out of the Spanish Occupy movement. And they had these massive protests in Spain for a lot of the same reasons that we did here in the United States. And they had these demonstrations and these popular assemblies, and they got to a point where they said, we can't accomplish what we need to accomplish unless we hold political power, unless we start getting ourselves in government. And they've done a fairly successful job at this. And there's a guy, a Spanish guy in Podemos, whose name is Pablo Iglesias, and he said this thing about popular organizing. He said that we can show up in the streets with as many banners and as many flags and as many pictures of our heroes and our martyrs as we want. But when we do that, our opponents, the conservatives, the fascists who are in power, the centrist Democrats, the moderates, the technocrats, and the elitists, they laugh at us because they're speaking in a language that people understand, and we're showing up with our slogans and our chants and our signs, and we're not speaking their language. And he said this other thing, this guy, Pablo. He said that there is more socialism in a grandfather teaching his grandson how to share his toys than there are in any of the banners that we can bring to a demonstration, than any number of slogans that we can put on a t-shirt. What I think that means here is that most people are already progressive. Being progressive is something that we do inherently. But we, the activists, the organizers, even those of us who hold elective office, we haven't given folks an opportunity to act on it. We haven't given them the opportunity to say, yes, here's where I can plug in. When I've gone knocking on doors in the 4th District, and we've hit about 500 doors here with our volunteers so far, just going straight down streets, not just focusing on the likely voters, just talking to everyone, right? I've heard this literally verbatim. You are the first candidate, an elected official, who has asked me what I want, asked me what my vision is for this community. And that kind of shocks me, right? Because when you talk to people, what they say is, we want affordable housing. We want to change our criminal justice system. We want to meet our climate goals. We want all of these things. And folks don't know what to do. So I think to be progressive is to create opportunities for the people who we are intending to represent to engage in the political process. And that's where we get our power, right? And if we create that, then there's more power than any one-off demonstration that we can organize, even though I've organized plenty of one-off demonstrations.
Do you see systemic discrimination and racial exclusion in the county or municipality that you are running for? If so, how would you address it as an elected official? What specific plans would you try to enact? If not, please describe your district.
Okay. It's funny that that's even a question, right? Do you see systemic discrimination or exclusion in your district, right? We live with these realities every single day, right? There's discrimination that happens on the basis of race, on the basis of class, gender identity, and sexual orientation. So our district, the 4th District, has one of the highest concentration of food service workers and service industry workers in the county, right? That is a group of people who are systematically exposed to higher levels of sexual harassment, racial discrimination, bullying from managers than other sectors of the economy. They're also the lowest paid sector of the economy. Service workers, food industry, hospitality make up around 14% of the workers in our county. So absolutely. And I think that we need to provide more stability for that sector of our economy, we need to push for a living wage, particularly for service workers. In terms of discrimination, there's also discrimination around housing. So I don't know how many folks know this, but in our county, you can refuse to rent to someone because they have housing assistance, because they're using a housing assistance voucher. You can just say, no, I'm not going to rent to you. And the surveys on that have found it's because of the impression that those landlords have of people who use those vouchers. Now, guess what demographics are disproportionately represented in people who are using housing vouchers? In this community, it's black folks, it's female-headed households, and it's people with disabilities. If you're systematically denying housing to a group of people on the basis of their income, and represented within that income bracket, within that housing voucher system, are groups that are being systematically discriminated against in other ways, that's a problem, right? That's one of the ways that something like white supremacy and economic injustice manifests here. So I support what's called a ban on source of income discrimination at the county level. It's something that the Office of Human Rights is working on already. And as you know, as I'm sure you know, the living wage is something that we're pushing for in the county as well. That's just to name a few. I mean, there are other things like the bar scene, right? There's groups like the Advocacy Center that do incredible trainings called the Bar Standard Training, teaching people how to recognize different instances of discrimination. So as a county level, we need to continue supporting groups like the Advocacy Center to do those kinds of training and that kind of work for people who work in the service industry.
Thank you. So what is your stance on increasing property taxes to address local community needs?
That's a great question. So another thing I've learned at the doors, right, talking to folks, is I ask, how's rent? Or, how are your taxes? Everyone's like, well, let me ask, hi, how are you, how's your rent, right? How are your taxes? Hi. But then I ask, okay, so what do you want to do about it? And they say, well, you know what? For homeowners that I've talked to, I know what my taxes are going to, right? They know that they're paying taxes into the city, the school, the county. A lot of folks have young children. They're happy to be paying taxes for the school district. They know that taxes to the county, that they go to the services that we use. At the same time, it's high, right? It's almost untenable. I've been living in my apartment downtown for 5 years, and I'm about to get priced out, right? I work at a nonprofit. I have a degree from Cornell, and I can barely afford to live in the district that I'm trying to represent, in an apartment that I've lived in for 5 years, right? So what do I think about increasing taxes? I think that we have to make hard choices on the legislature. We manage a budget of over 170, well, not we, but our county, right? And our legislators are responsible for managing a budget of over $170 million. A large portion of that, around $100 million, comes from state and federal sources. The rest of it we're raising through tax levies, right? And we're doing that through property taxes, and we're doing that through sales taxes. There's a lot of uncertainty right now in terms of different types of federal funding that are coming to us, as well as things like the sales tax, right? So something that I learned recently through a recent legislature meeting and a conversation with the legislator is we may not be able to tap into those same sources of sales tax funding that we have in the past. And whether we do or we don't, this kind of uncertainty is what we're going to see more of under the federal administration. So the question then becomes, what are we using our money for? And what can we count on our legislators to use our money for? And I think what it really comes down to is, what are progressives going to stand up for? Are we going to stand up for giving money to people who need it most, to fighting for the folks who are the most vulnerable? Are we going to choose to say, yeah, I can take a little bit more taxes if it means that more people in our community are included? I think that's what the Democratic Party should stand up for, right? I think if you look at the congressional race like John Ossoff, and you see in the 6th district in Georgia, you see him running away from things like single payer. That's not what we need to do in the Democratic Party. That's not what we need to do if we're going to call ourselves progressives. And we need to know that we can count on our legislators to stand up for that.
Thank you. We have 9 minutes left for the rest of our questions, so that's a heads up.
So, the IDA has pretty consistently approved projects that involve large buildings that will eventually add a lot to our tax base. But what do you think of that? Does that meet our needs in this county? And if not, how would you change how the IDA operates and its rules?
That's such an important question. I live on the Commons, so I see it go up, right? And there's this public perception. A lot of people they see that, and then they contrast it with how hard it is to live in this county and afford rent. And you say, I know that this huge building that's going up got a tax abatement and I can't afford my rent, right? So there's a lot of frustration with the IDA. There's a lot of frustration around these abatements. So what are abatements for? So an abatement is basically a tax break, right? And the idea is you want to give these tax breaks out to projects that wouldn't be able to be built otherwise. That's what they're there to incentivize. And so the current round of abatements that we see when you walk down the Commons and you see these new buildings, right? They were put in place to, in essence, prove that we could develop downtown, that our Commons was a vital economic sector, right? I think it's accomplished that. But an abatement is a specific tool that's been used for a lot of projects. And those abatements haven't always been granted with assurances that in addition to just raising the baseline of the taxes for our community, that there are other things we're going to get out of it, right? That we're going to have living wage jobs in the buildings that are being built, that they're going to be built to the highest energy efficiency standards, that the employment there is going to pay a living wage and have diversity hiring requirements, right? We don't have enforceable mechanisms in place for those tax abatements. And they do in other communities. But I think that it's really important for us to look at economic development a little bit more broadly than are we or aren't we going to continue giving away millions of dollars to large developers. And I'm not saying I have something against large developers from a formal perspective, right? But I think we need to look at this issue a little bit more broadly, and I think it's time for us to rethink the CTAP program and the mechanisms that the process that the IDA is using, specifically who's making those decisions as well, right? And who's being consulted in putting these things forward.
Thank you. Governor Cuomo wants every county in the state to look into consolidation of government offices. How do you think that Tompkins County should approach this? How would you go about implementing your recommendation?
So there's a great example of one of the ways that this is kind of playing out locally, right? So we're undergoing a study right now. The county is undergoing a study with the same consulting firm that's doing the jail study on shared services for policing and the sheriff and a couple of other police enforcement entities in different municipalities. One of the first concerns that comes up for me is thinking about the work I've had the opportunity to do professionally in following the IPD and their anti-bias training, their movements toward or away from community policing, their response to uneven policing of certain communities of color in particular. They've made steps forward. And even if they're not perfect, right, they have made some steps forward that not every law enforcement department has in our county. And so when we're talking about sharing services, we need to think about how are the quality of those services going to be impacted, right? I think efficiency is a good thing. You know, whether you're a capitalist or a communist or a democratic socialist, using using our resources efficiency, stewarding those resources wisely, is the responsibility of those of us who are elected in office and those of us who are working around these progressive values. But we really need to think about who's benefiting if we make these changes, and how are they going to impact the community broadly? How are they going to impact the services that we're offering through our community?
Well, again, I sense that you are very much in support of single-payer health care. So, guess what? I am too. But, so, are you worried about potential loss of federal funding for Medicaid? And if that did happen, how would you approach this with your colleagues to do your best to ensure everyone receives health care?
Yes, I'm worried. Yes, I'm worried. I think we're probably all worried about that. So what's the statistic that something like if the ACA was repealed, that there'd be 7% of the population in our county would be affected by this? That's enormous. That's enormous. So there's the technicalities and the specifics of administering that and governing that situation should it come to pass. But I think that what we really need to remember is that since the Trump administration has been in power and since the Republicans have controlled Congress, we've been in a perpetual state of crisis, and that crisis is being pushed down to us, and we are experiencing it in this question that we're asking. And we must not lose sight of that bigger picture, because I think that we need to fight back on the same scale as that, right? So if the ACA should be repealed, then what we're going to have to look to is how can we provide the most services to the people who are most impacted first and worst for the most using our money most efficiently and using the resources most wisely. So there are groups like the Ithaca Health Alliance that are doing a great job of providing free services to members of our community. I think that we're going to need to work with different healthcare providers, with different community organizations that provide various services that intersect with the way that healthcare is provided, whether it's the Ithaca Health Alliance or whether it's churches and food pantries and groups that are doing these kinds of direct services to figure out how are we going to make sure that those who are going to be hit first and worst are getting the services that they need in an efficient way. It's almost inconceivable to think about how do we respond to that big of a cut. But when you're faced with a big challenge, I think it's also important to take a big step forward. And ultimately, we can't raise the money locally to provide the same level of services for healthcare. That's something that has to happen at the state level or that has to happen at the national level. And alongside any of those sort of mitigation effects, any of those stopgaps that we're using to protect people and assure them that we can provide the most healthcare possible, we need to take the fight to the state and say it's time for New York State to have single-payer healthcare. It's time for universal healthcare to be treated for what it is, a human right.
Have you read the bill? Have you
What's
read
that?
the New York Health Act?
I know of it, yeah.
I would encourage you to read it. It doesn't take that long. Encourage everyone to read
So I think we're only going to have time for one more of our questions. Katie, do you want to?
Yeah, so this will be brief, and then we'll take questions from the audience. What is your approach to consensus building in a group, and can you give an example of your approach to it?
To consensus building. Sure. I don't know, maybe I've just been in too many progressive organizing meetings, but sometimes consensus is this word that we use to mean the best and only way to ever make decisions. Sometimes a really outspoken member of a group can stop an entire process by demanding that their interests be included in whatever you're working on. I'm not going to mention the demographics of that likely character, but, it can really throw things off. So, consensus is a tool that is in the toolbox of any facilitator, any organizer, right? It's an approach to decision making. And I think that when we're talking about consensus, we have to think consensus around what? I'll just give a quick example of, building consensus. I'll give two. So I work with a group of teenagers through my job at MRC, and we actually teach them how to reach consensus, and we teach them the difference between consensus and majority vote. So we actually have them choose the campaigns that they're working on, right? And so they had these 4 campaigns that they wanted to work on, and we went through a voting process, and they voted on their campaigns. The top 2 went on to a second round where they had to reach consensus upon which of the 2 they would work on. This is a very fiery, very woke group of young people who have very passionate opinions about what they're doing. And so the consensus process that we use, just in this is very descriptive of the process itself, was, you do a go-around, then you do a go-around where you do direct responses, and then you begin to state the emerging consensus, and then you have a go-around around the proposal, and then eventually you realize that you're synthesizing ideas, and that through that process of ongoing dialogue in a structured way that's inclusive of all opinions, that's how you reach consensus. Another quick example. Do I have time for another quick example? No, I don't have time for another quick example. Yeah?
Do you like your answers?
I facilitated, in 2012, I worked for a group called 350.org. They're a climate action group. And we facilitated a statewide coalition called Don't Frack New York, whose job was to organize a massive rally, coalition, and weekend-long training in Albany to get to not frack New York. There was a contingent in that group that said, we won't participate unless you agree to include criminalizing fracking in your position on banning it through the DEC. They said, we want to use the penal code, not the environmental regulations. And the core planning group said, we're not going to do that. And they said, fine, we're walking away from the table. And they did. And they told people not to go to our rally. And 2,500 people showed up. But those folks walked away from the table because we weren't willing to reach consensus around that particular point because there was a larger issue driving our need to move forward. So, you can reach consensus when it's really important to reach consensus, when you have a group of 12 people who need to work together on something. When you have a coalition of, 40, 50 groups, sometimes you can't reach consensus and you have to make those hard choices.
Thank you. So we have time for probably 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Teresa?
What would you suggest that the county do to get more affordable housing?
God, if I had the answer to that question, the whole thing would be easy. I think that there are a couple of things that we can do that I know are going to have a positive impact on this. One of them is the source of income discrimination, making sure that at least folks are having equal access to our housing stock, which is too expensive and in too short supply. Another thing is that in the county's really, really thorough process, I think it's of addressing the housing crisis. I think we need to make space, a formal space, for tenants to have a voice in the process, at the table. A formal structure for including tenants' voices doesn't exist. So the housing strategy, which was the draft housing strategy, which was released publicly, I think last week or maybe the week before, I'm trying to remember when it showed up in my inbox, now has a nice highlighted statement saying we need to think about some specific vulnerabilities, particularly vulnerabilities of LGBT folks, of other demographics that have been disproportionately harmed in this crisis. And I like to think that got into that housing strategy because there were a number of members of the public who were engaged in an open process to contribute that. I mean, I wrote a comment that literally, I did a Google search of all the housing, or little word search of all the housing documents. It was like, does the acronym LGBT show up in this? Does the word race show up? The word race didn't show up in the housing strategy except in a census, a citation of a census figure. Come on. That seems like an obvious one. So I think that we need to really make sure that in any approach that we have, right? Because I don't think anyone has the answer. We have a strategy that's been proposed now that will be voted on by the legislature. We need to really think about that process and who's being included in it. Because if we don't think about who's included and whose voices are at the table, we're going to create back doors for those same systems of discrimination that we're trying to address to just come right back in a new form and under a new strategy.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last very short question and really short answer if you guys want to take the time to do that, or we can. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Reed.
Yeah. Thank you.